Hey there, I hope everyone had a great Memorial Day weekend. Thanks for joining us for yet another installment of our series, The Intersection of Innovation and Technology with Society. We've been branching out a little bit. We just spoke last week about the impact on education. We're returning today with one of my favorite guests and one of my favorite people to a topic that's near and dear to me on both personal and professional levels, and that's the notion of the intersection of publishing these days and how innovation and technology has really disrupted the publishing scene, but really taking a deeper dive into the ways in which artists are, and in some cases are not, compensated. So the issue of compensation in writing has really heated up as we see content as ubiquitous as it's ever been, but in terms of the sourcing and the ways in which writers are either recognized or paid, it's a very complicated issue. And I can't think of many people better to have to opine on this subject than my friend Bethanne Patrick. Bethanne, who you may remember from a previous session, has had her fingers and toes in virtually all aspects of the publishing world. Bethanne, let me bring you in and you can remind everyone exactly what you've done and what you've been up to even since we last spoke, and then we can kick it off.
Sounds good.
So remind us your areas of expertise. I'd rather you boast than me boast for you.
No humble brags here. I guess my area of expertise is sort of knowing a great deal about the changes that have taken place in the publishing industry in the past 10 to 15 years, because I've been there along for the ride. I've been an editor at AOL Books. I've blogged for various places, including Publishers Weekly. I'm a book reviewer. Right now, I'm the books editor at Washingtonian Magazine. And my reviews have appeared in other places, the Washington Post, Oprah Magazine, that sort of thing. And I also created, founded, sort of nursed along a hashtag on Twitter called Friday Reads, in which people share the latest books they're reading. And it's become sort of a thing unto itself, which is really fun. And that's given me even more of a window into what readers and authors are up to these days. And I think that has a lot to do with what we're going to talk about today, actually, because one of the things that I've seen in this decade and a half or so that I've been in this industry is changes coming that bring readers and authors closer together all the time.
Yeah, I mean, I would say you have definitely been at the forefront, and like you said, you've actually had you've been doing it, not just a witness, but
right,
an active participant. So your insight and experience are unquestioned.
And I'm also an author, and we're going to talk about that. I have two nonfiction books from National Geographic, and one of the things that we'll talk about today is compensation. And for my second book, I just received my first royalty check. And so that's very exciting, and it's also something that's becoming increasingly uncommon. So we can talk about that as well.
I was going to say, congratulations and royalty check. What is that?
Exactly.
That's some relic from the 20th century, right?
It really is. And you don't get a royalty check. My first book was a work made for hire. My second book was a contracted book negotiated by my literary agent. And so what happens is, for those out there who don't know this, you don't get any royalties on books that are sold until you quote unquote earned out. In other words, you've earned out the amount of your advance, and that is done on a percentage basis. It would be great if it were the full cover price, right? Wouldn't that be fabulous?
Right.
Would have earned out so quickly, but no. So it takes a little while, and it doesn't always happen these days. That's another thing, and the problem with that for authors of all stripes is that means if you don't earn out, that your next book's contract may be affected by that. So it's a really big deal. It's one of the reasons why a lot of people are choosing different routes, like you.
Right. Well, and that's the thing, right? I mean, I was going to say your next contract might be affected, or you might not have a next contract. I certainly have known novelists that had critically acclaimed books that just didn't happen to move sufficient numbers of units, and they had a difficult time even landing a publisher for their follow-up. And to me, that when I started hearing stories like that early in the earlier parts of last decade, that's when I realized that the system was really ripe for disruption, just in the sense that if a author has run the gauntlet of finding a way to get that novel or nonfiction book for that matter published, there is a certain amount of screening that's occurred and a certain amount of expertise that has been kind of reinforced in order to get that to that part of the process. That doesn't mean that they should be guaranteed a endless stream of houses willing to publish them, but I thought it was a very bad sign that based on your last sales that you might not be able to attract a publisher, because to me that didn't necessarily mean the publishers were wrong, but that it had become a zero-sum game of what we see in the movie industry a lot. You need to count on what you can sell, and the opening weekend needs to be huge to validate the endeavor. And I think that's why things like Sundance and whatever, all the things that followed that really became prevalent. I think what we've seen in the last few years is a super speed adaptation in the publishing world of different options, whether it's independent publishing, just a lot of guerrilla tactics that are necessary because the money maybe isn't there, period.
Well, a great example of this that I blogged about for Washingtonian recently, and I wanted to let everyone know about it, is a great guy named Dallas Hudgens. And Dallas got his MFA at George Mason University right down the road from us, and was contracted for at least 2 books with Scribner, very fine literary fiction imprint, one of the oldest around. And he published his 2 books with them, and they were given good reviews. They were not bad books, but they were mid-list. They didn't sell very much. And the end of the road came, and Dallas was very canny, and he saw this early on. And so he decided about, 6 or 7 years ago, to publish his stories, Wake Up, We're Here, in what I call craft publishing. And his PR, Lauren Sarand, who's another great person to follow on social media, they came up with that term. It's like small batch bourbon making, right?
Right.
So I love this. He started Relegation Books, and in September they're going to publish their first author since Dallas, so they're becoming a real imprint, a real publisher. And not only that, but he's taken some of the money that Relegation Books has made and brought it back to George Mason and opened this thing called Stillhouse Press for the MFA students. So now when you're getting your master's in fine arts and you're learning about writing your novel or your short story collection, you'll also learn about the publishing process. And the reason this is important, Sean, is all the things you've talked about are so true and so hard for writers. But if we know more about the industry and more about the process and demystify it, then it can help people know, what should I be making money on? What is worth making money on? Which route should I take?
Yeah, and I think it's good to hear that we're taking a look at the MFA level. I mean, props to Dallas for doing that first, but it's increasingly necessary. I don't think it's an add-on. We're really doing our students a disservice if they think anymore in this current landscape that being an artist is in and of itself sufficient. It certainly is in terms of the art of expression, and the real impetus behind any creative act is just to get it out there, perhaps without any commercial aspirations. But the reality is it is a business, and being utterly naive about how the business works doesn't do anyone any good. So I think that's going to be an increasingly important component of all MFA programs. But to take like a slight step back, I think one of the things I've said repeatedly in this series is when I've spoken to students or at a reading or I've taken this question, my kind of stock phrase, and it's based on my own experience as a reader and a writer, is that because of all these advancements and the innovation that's in play, whether it's through social media or blogs, web pages, it's never been an easier time to have your work out there. At the same time, because of, in part, the competition, it's never been more difficult to get paid for it. And I think that's the conundrum that we're currently in, and maybe how we work our way out of that is very much a story that's still being written, literally and figuratively. But you recently were at a conference where that very issue came up, correct?
I was, and it was really interesting. I went to Grub Street as a writers collective in Boston, and every year they have a conference called the Muse and the Marketplace, which is really clever because they're putting those two things together, and that's really what it's about, this conference. It's not just about perfecting your writing, it's about learning what the business side of publishing is all about. And this year's keynote speaker was one of your former guests, a friend of mine, Jane Friedman.
Mm-hmm.
And Jane is one of I always call her young Jane Friedman because there's Jane Friedman is a publishing icon who now runs Open Road Media, and so there are two Jane Friedmans. But young Jane Friedman is a woman who really knows a lot about the intersection of digital media and publishing, and she gave a very interesting keynote about the idea of artist compensation and where the idea that a writer or a novelist or a memoirist, whatever, what have you, should be paid for his or her work, where that came from. And the interesting thing is, it wasn't something that was even thought about for hundreds of years. When people wrote, they were being supported by a university, by the church, by another institution, by a wealthy, noble person. And this went on. I mean, there's a famous scene in, I'm trying to remember which Jane Austen, I feel so silly that I can't. I want to say it's in Pride and Prejudice, where one of the protagonists is fussing over an inscription to a duke because he's paying a great deal to have the book published. And I can't believe that has slipped my mind, Sean. But anyway, I think it is a modern construct that we get paid for discrete pieces of work, but that doesn't mean it's a bad construct. It just means that there are different ways of compensating artists. That's all.
Yeah, and I think, when it comes, I think most people most lay people are more kind of comfortable with the idea when it comes to quote unquote art. The cliche "no one owes you a living" is something that every aspiring artist gets to know on some level pretty early on. I think where it gets extremely complicated and much more troubling is the notion of journalism and news. And I think what we've seen with, say, the Huffington Post model, which was, like most revolutions, messy and overwhelming, and now, with hindsight, maybe too much of a good thing, which is the idea that a very widely read site now has the prerogative to say, we don't offer any compensation, but everyone is a brand now, so by appearing at such and such a site like ours, it's priceless commodity to have all of our eyeballs reading your work. And I think where the rubber meets the road on that is for blogs and guest posts. I would imagine most writers would be comfortable with that arrangement. But when it comes to things like news, how far down that road and down that rabbit hole are we going where we're not willing to pay for actual reporting? And I think with newspapers and magazines losing money, it seems like that's going to get more complicated, not less so. Would you agree with that?
I do agree with that. It's going to get messier before it gets better. And I don't know if I talked about this last time. I hope that I didn't. But if I did, bear with me for a second.
It bears repeating.
It does bear repeating because the Huffington Post comes out, it's AOL now. And I worked at AOL, and I was only there for a few years. But a few years at AOL is like, a decade anywhere else. But one of the things that I found when I was there is people really believed that the web was just a marketing tool. They really thought that anything that went up on AOL was just a piece of marketing, and that therefore anything that they were interested in selling, the publishers, I would just slap up. And I surprised a lot of people by saying, no, I'm not going to just put that up. I haven't even looked at it. I don't know if it's a good book or not. I want to make this more editorially driven. So that was one shift, right? Then you have this shift that comes later, and as you said, a very messy one, of going to free content. So it's editorially driven, but people are putting it up there for free. And as you mentioned, Sean, that's great when you're trying to promote something. So you've got a book out, and you want to write an essay that's tied to the book, and you don't mind putting it up for free because it didn't take you very long. But when it comes to putting your name behind real reporting, it's different. because real reporting takes a lot of time. It takes a lot of maintenance of a network. I mean, I haven't been, a beat reporter in the same way that some of the journalists we're going to talk about today have been. But that really, I know the kind of work that it takes. I know that it is really labor intensive, and you can't do it for free and still eat. And therefore, you would have a lot of dead journalists. I mean, people need to be able to feed and house and clothe themselves. And so when you say all journalism should just be free and up for grabs, it gets really messy, not just because people aren't making money to survive, but also because people aren't making the kind of money they need to produce the good kind of journalism, to be able to have the tools and the access and to be able to decide if they need to take a source out for a lunch and so on and so forth. There's so many things involved in this. It really bothers me. I know that it bothers you as well. I think journalists need to be compensated.
Well, yeah, and I think it's given rise to a cynicism that's become increasingly commonplace and pervasive, in the sense that it's a self-perpetuating horror story where even whether it's the politicians or the newsrooms kind of understand and embrace the idea that all news is a news cycle, and so every event is pertinent and crucial for those 10 minutes. So even if something is truthful, something else is going to happen 10 minutes later that knocks that off the the scroll at the top of the screen. Right. So the premium put on newsworthy stories, or just news with a capital N, is now secondary. And I think it's doubly bad because the newspapers and magazines really are shrinking and being consolidated, so they don't have money to throw at the problem. But I think what you're talking about is another intersection, and that's integrity versus being solvent financially. And that's where I think I'm extremely pessimistic about the appetite, the public appetite for helping support this good material or worthwhile news that isn't owned by someone, that doesn't come from a blog that has an agenda.
Exactly. I don't know. I can't remember. Was it Mike Judge who made Idiocracy? Have you seen that movie? I'm afraid, especially when I saw, remember in Idiocracy, Starbucks is like such a coffee is everywhere. And when I saw the new short stories on the Chipotle cups, that was the first thing I thought of. What are we doing? Are we taking things that are meant to be consumed, carefully and slowly, and just trying to make them bite-sized? It all started with charticles and listicles in journalism, right? It's this horrible slippery slope. Next thing you know, we're going to have little chips embedded in our Starbucks cups that give us, Fox News all the time. Oh, the horror! Right.
Or yeah, it'll be short stories and novels will now be tweetworthy. Like, what was the moral of that novel? Let me just get down to what in 140 characters? What would I take away from Moby Dick?
Exactly. People just want these takeaways. And so what you were saying about the news and journalism and magazines and newspapers in particular, what gets left out is analysis. Because if a story has a 10-minute shelf life, why are you going to bother connecting it to something that happened 2 weeks ago? So that frightens me as well. And again, I think to go back to what I was saying about AOL marketing, it was really tough for sites like AOL and others to figure out how to make advertising work. It took a few years to get that, but now we know that advertising can work online. It works differently, but it does work. So there's no reason to say, oh, we can't have a Time magazine online because we can't sell ads against it. You can sell ads against it, and people will pay attention to them. I know more and more people are saying that, Google ads work, which is terrifying in its own way. But since you can do this, what is the problem? And I think the problem is drilling down. In publishing, we talk a lot about the problem of discoverability, of people finding new books. The problem is getting people to go beyond that first page of their tablet And it's not just about continuing to read a particular article. It's about all of the other articles that your eye might light on when you're reading a print, product.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that is training us, is training our entire society to be very superficial and not to look beyond the headlines and not to look beyond the cat videos.
Yeah, and I mean, and even the content that is defensible, there's so much of it. I think we've always, I think the kind of the tension between time and history and innovation is that we're always packing more information into what our brains are capable of kind of comprehending. Certainly, the internet escalated that, a millionfold, and I think all of us, even old-fashioned, analog readers, will recognize that there really is only so much time to consume. I mean, I've always confessed that I am not a good Twitter citizen, but it's really because it is too much of a good thing. There's so much material and content that could be a full-time job just trying to keep up with that. Much less Facebook, much less, wherever your other sources of information are. To me, that's the real tension underlying all of this, which is these intersections. We talk about the democratization of content, which is a theory and a concept I wholeheartedly endorse, but then at what expense? Because we do get the democracy that we demand or pay for. If we're not willing to pay for it, then how democratic is our democracy? So it's a very slippery slope, as you say.
It really is, and I don't know if we're going to come up with anything, interesting that hasn't been said about it necessarily today, but I do know that I feel people aren't talking about it enough. People are accepting too much the idea that they just won't get paid for things. And part of this is because, I've been a blogger, I know bloggers, I love bloggers. I think part of this is because so many bloggers who have come up along the way have been doing it alongside of something else. It isn't their full-time job, or they never expected to make money off of it. And so they continue to fuel the non-professional, if you will. And I don't mean to make that a pejorative. Amateur can be a great thing, but because they're not expecting to make any money, they're like, sure, throw out my post over there on HuffPo, or yeah, sure, I'll do a guest post for you and not get paid for it. And then those of us who remember the days when you could get $3, $4, $5 a word for a magazine, I know that those days are gone. I know that doesn't exist. What needs to still exist, though, is paying people who write something, because they are doing something. I read somewhere recently that in World War I, people who were thinkers in the French army, whether they were lawyers or whether they were communications specialists, got extra rations because mind work was seen as so difficult and so, you needed more protein. And I think people don't realize how difficult writing is. They think, and maybe that's because they see so much bad writing. They see bad reporting. They don't realize what the good kind can give to them.
Yeah, and to a certain extent that breeds its own apathy. And I think the other real problem that a lot of these legitimate, established publications are running up against, especially in the magazine and newspaper world, is that even if you do kind of pull the plug and say it's not free, we are going to put a value on the work we produce, the simple fact of the matter is there's so much competing content that enough people have said, I am going to vote with my wallet, and I would rather have mediocre content for free than excellent content, for a price. And we see that play out. Musicians are absolutely struggling with that now. The idea that if you're not on Spotify, you're nobody. But to be on Spotify means you're not going to get paid. And so it is definitely a catch-22 that exists across the board. But what you and I keep circling back to, because I think we both understand the difference and have a vested interest, again, personally and professionally, is the idea of professional writing done by professionals. There's nothing elitist about that. There's nothing elitist about good reporting, factual reporting, things that stand up to scrutiny and analysis. The bigger question then becomes, I think what we're wrestling with is how much is analytical competence worth, and is that something that's being devalued financially, but also just morally in our society, and that's kind of a frightening thought.
It is a frightening thought, and but to go back to musicians for just a second, one of the things that I think about when like you said, if you're not on Spotify, you're nothing. But a musician may give away a single or an album for free, but musicians can still, although this is shrinking too, make money on concerts and live performances.
That's right.
There's no way for a writer, unless you're Neil Gaiman or J.K. Rowling, to make money, a real money off of readings or live performances or showing up, for a signing. People have to buy a book. And we could go on and on about that, which is a whole other hangout. But I do think that it does come back to people do think that calling some writing professional, calling journalism professional, saying that journalists hold up to a certain code of ethics, all of that, they think that it is elitist, and it's not. And maybe that's one of the things that our society has to struggle with before, people who write will again have a good model for being compensated. Maybe we have to, break down the idea that this is not just some kind of, intellectual.
Sure. And I think that what is both encouraging and frightening when I think about it is the idea that none of this exists in a vacuum. So when I see people talking about Amazon or taking on Spotify or a lot of these easy villains, the reality is some of the discourse has been purposefully and cynically dumbed down by politicians.
Right.
So news organizations have been fighting against that for a couple of decades now. The concept of blogs now replacing news, well, reality TV and those kind of shows started taking over for the so-called news. So there's a lot of forces at play, and that's why I don't use the word society lightly in this series.
Right.
None of these issues that we talk about, especially compensation, kind of can be solved by publishers for published writers. It's a whole societal kind of mentality and a way of maybe restructuring the way we even view these things. And it's going to take a lot of work and a lot of education. And the big question is, are people willing? What is the necessary investment for an individual to even have a stake in this?
That's a really good question, Sean. I remember years ago when I was offered my first job in publishing out of college, the amount was so low that I wound up getting frightened and got married and left publishing. No, but it was horribly low, and that was understood at the time. And I don't know if it still is, that people who went into publishing usually had familial support, inherited wealth, mom and dad helping, all that sort of thing. And my mom and dad certainly they were kind of like, okay, it's time to move. But I think that has to be struck down. We can't have that as a bar to people, entering the world of words anymore. We can't say that it's an elite kind of club where only people with, a lot of money can enter. That's one thing that can change. Another thing that can change is that people can become more realistic about the place that writing a book will hold in their financial lives, and be really realistic about what other kinds of employment they might need to have. And this is a time-honored thing. Jane talked about it a bit in her keynote. We could talk about it another time as well. But T.S. Eliot worked in a bank. Chaucer was a civil servant, etc.
Yep. Yeah, I mean, and I think I can put it in pretty stark, if comedic terms, when people it's very flattering when people ask me, how are sales going on my memoir? And I say, I'm almost out of debt. So to have a ostensibly successful launch, not only is there no guarantee of money, the only guarantee is that you'll probably have some debt. And it really does, though. It does get down to the basic question. And it also circles back something else I've said, when people kind of turn their nose up and say, well, this is bad because there's so much content out there now, it's dumbing down the literary discourse. And my feeling is, let the people decide what's worth reading. The publishers have a lot of blood on their own hands in terms of who sells books these days. famous people and people that write memoirs for being famous.
Oh yes, that's a whole, and that's another whole other hangout. We have
absolutely,
yeah.
Like, but what publishing, the mistakes that publishing has willfully made, understanding as always it's a business, so no one can begrudge to keep the operation flowing. Money needed to be brought in, but there was an inherent cynicism in the publishing world too that really opened up a lot of room for this disruption that we're seeing play out now.
Exactly. But I think in the long run, something is going to happen, but it is going to be messy for a while longer, and we all have to pay a lot of attention. I think that's the most important thing.
Well, it'll remain messy, and I will publicly ask you back for your third visit as soon as you're able to do it. And I'd love to dive a little bit deeper into the whole notion, which we both have personal experience with, of actually writing and what the publishing world has done and what it may do, and how some of that disruption, there's a lot of pros and cons, and it's interesting to see how writers and readers will have a real stake in seeing how that shakes out.
I think that'd be really interesting, so love to come back for a third time and talk about that, Sean.
Awesome. Well, Bethanne, thank you so much. Everyone, please follow Bethanne. Why am I forgetting that your Twitter?
It's at the Book Maven.
At the Book Maven, and then it's Friday Reads. Why am I forgetting the
Friday Reads? I don't know.
Okay, Friday Reads. All right, I knew it. At Friday Reads, and we're going to put links to this up on our Facebook pages, so take a look for that. And thanks for joining us. Bethanne, thanks for being here. It's always a pleasure, and already looking forward to round 3.
Likewise. Take care, Sean. Bye-bye.
Bye.